Are you able to share our screen for the land acknowledgement? And perfect. Thanks everyone and welcome. We're so happy to be here with everyone virtually all across northern BC. So just want to take a minute to acknowledge and be grateful that we were all able to gather together in this way and have some deep learning, I think, and some reflection and talk about plans moving forward as well. So many thanks to all of you. I also would like to acknowledge that although we're all attending from different places, I'm situated on the unceded ancestral lands of the Lheidli T'enneh. Lheidli T'enneh means people of the confluence of the river. And this is not a picture. I used the wrong slide. As I said, this is a picture of the Nechako and Fraser rivers of where they met. It is not. It is a picture of the pit house, which you can find along the trail behind UNBC. But back to the Fraser and Nechako rivers, that's where the Lheidli T'enneh peoples lived before they were forced onto reserve lands, which is quite far away from the urban center of Prince George now. They have over 400 members and are a self-reliant community. And from my experience of working with Lheidli T'enneh people as a long-term settler in this community, they have consistently defended and protects and support our local environment, education, health, and social systems. So it's important to our seed team that we don't view the land acknowledgement as a box to tick off or as a customary practice, but rather a commitment to uphold the values of the distinct and diverse Indigenous cultures across the North and do the work we do through the lens of reconciliation, recognizing racism, saviorism, and biases within our own practices, and actively working to upset colonial structures. So as we consider our own work moving forward within our collective teams, we can look towards champions like Cindy Blackstock and Margot Greenwood, who have been leaders in childhood wellness. So I'd like to take the time now to introduce a very dear friend of mine, Sonia Rock, who's joining us today. Sonia has been one of my close friends for several years now. We entered the master's program together and went through that process together, and we've worked in the school district together. And I'm really honored to introduce her here to open up our meeting in a good way. So Sonia, if you want to take it over.
Thank you, Lisa. Excuse me. Simgigat Sigidim Hana and Hanitus Kubuil Sasu. Spa last boy eat and wilps so much in will lose witwe. E lo body as Amasatun will side Gordon dim Lusewam La wish Uba Majagalech calls up. Lo body will al hooksy lawsome. Good morning. My matriarch name is Spatlast, and I come from the house of Ximutzin in the Gitxsan territory. And I acknowledge that we are on the Lheidli territory. I thank them for allowing us to work and live on their territory. I'm really honored to be here with you today and to meet all of you. I'm very interested in learning what is happening with this process and being a part of it and participating and meeting all of you. I would like to ask that we bow our heads in prayer. Samogit lutat mlahagi. Gidacham nain omeni. Dem destas walgan edit kal huksit lom al amasatun. Dem le say le wish uba mazagalech kals up. Dem sarait il karodem at hem. Saram dem wish uba skim. In it gidacham lach ulwan al satun. Creator, I thank you for this opportunity for us to meet, to discuss the importance of our little flowers of the community, our children. I thank you for the opportunity for meeting my friends from all across British Columbia. And I ask you to bless each person that is here today to discuss our children, all my relations.
Many thanks, Sonia.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you, Sonia. I think I'll turn it to Joanne. Will begin, or Erica, were you going to say anything just to, okay. Great.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly add in about what we're going to use for collecting some of the questions today. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that shows up. So during the presentation today, we're going to use Padlet, and I'll put the link in the chat to share questions. You can also, the reason we wanted to use Padlet is it helps us kind of keep a record of, the questions that have come up. If there's any resources people want to share, it's something we can go back to as a leadership group afterwards, as we look to plan for next steps after this webinar. So to add a question, you just click on the little plus sign. It'll prompt a little box to come up and you can add in your question. We've also added the opportunity to share resources with the group and to think about how we're feeling hearing these results, and if there's any, does the data reflect your experiences over this time period? And if you see a comment that, you really, or a question you'd really like us to answer, you can hit the little thumbs up just to show that, yeah, you want to hear the answer to that too. And you can add comments to the other posts that attendees add as well. So I've posted the link to that in the chat, and I'll add it again throughout the conversation, just because I know that as more people join in, they might not see the current chat. But I think that's it for that. And so I'll pass it back to you, Kate and Joanne, to get us started with the presentation.
Great. Hi, Kate, do you want to introduce yourself first and then I'll launch in?
Sure. So hello, it's lovely to see so many people. Hopefully we can get some time and cameras on and have a little chat at some points through this. My name is Kate Bume. I am with the Human Early Learning Partnership on the Knowledge to Action team. I'm a knowledge broker there. And I'm calling today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in what's now known as Vancouver, and I'm a settler here. And I've been with HELP for about 4 years, but my background is working with youth and families with young children as a social worker. And so then moving into this role at HELP to try and support communities to use their data. And I'm very grateful to be invited to this session. I'm excited to speak with you more as we go forward.
Thanks, Kate. I'm Joanne Schroeder. Wanted to say thank you, Sonia, very much for opening us in such a good way. And Lisa, too, thank you for your thoughtful acknowledgement of the territory. I'm joining today from the unsurrendered lands of the Comox First Nation, what we now call Vancouver Island, where I'm very grateful to have been settled for about 35 years now. So, so we're going to get started. I think, Kate, we're going to have slides. I sure hope we're going to have slides, she said. So really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today. Really appreciate SEED and the leadership and membership of SEED for continuing to raise the flag, carry the torch, whatever metaphor we use for young children in the North. So really happy to be part of this discussion today. I've been around at HELP for off and on since its inception, which is a little over 20 years ago now. We were founded in 2000 as a research center, as it says there, really trying to figure out the differences that make a difference in the children's early years. Although these days we also talk about other years, but today we're really going to focus on early development. Go ahead, Kate. The University of BC, where much of our work takes place, is on the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and grateful to be part of that institution that the Musqueam people have shepherded and really contributed to for so many years. Okay, this is what we're going to do. Brief overview about the early years sector. The folks from SEED are going to say a bit of background in terms of their work. Then Kate and I are going to share some data with you, both provincial data trends over the last couple of decades, and then to sort of hone in, focus in on some of the trends that we have been seeing in the North. We have created space for question and answer, but I really, really encourage you as we go along, if there's something that you want to jump in on, don't hesitate. Throw up your electronic hand, because obviously I can't see everybody as we go. I know Erica said we'll also be capturing questions as we go on the Padlet. So, but want to make this as interactive as possible given our Zoom world and the amount of information that we have to get through. Then we're going to look a little bit at some of the other tools that help authors within the monitoring system, and talk a little bit about the so what, what's next, where do we go from here? Why more data? So, as I said, I've been at HELP for a very long time, and we've been collecting population level data on young children. In particular, the EDI was our early development instrument, our first project all those years ago. And sometimes data can be discouraging. Data can feel like we're not learning anything new. But I have a strong belief, commitment to the value of this data as a way to really give us a strong picture of how our children are doing. And more importantly, I think it's really about how our systems are doing in supporting children. So when I look at early development instrument results, as we're going to today, I think of them more of a reflection of the system and the inequities that exist within the system than I think of them as a reflection of children, or some kind of some sort of strength or challenge for individual children and families. That's not how we use the data. We really use the data, understand the quality of experiences that children have had before they get to school, and how the systems have supported those children or not, and really want to be able to shine the light in a way that gives our children voice. That to me is the strongest reason to collect population level data, is it gives our children a voice, and it gives us a tool as people who care about children to get out in the world and spread that voice, and get out in the world and say, hey, maybe our systems are not working in the way that we intend them to work. So yes, sometimes data can be a bit Debbie Downerish, but I really think the power of it, and the unique power that we have within BC because of the years of collecting data, gives us a stronger voice and gives our children a stronger voice. So yeah, enough said about that. The reflections that we learn about when we try to understand the EDI results is really a complex thing. People will often say to me, what do we need to do to change the EDI? And it's not a simple answer to that question because of the complexity of the context that influence children's development. So you see a couple of graphics here. One is developed at the Human Early Learning Partnership. The other has been developed by the First Nations Health Authority, both of which are reminding us about the variety of influences on children's development, from the most intimate, so sort of the neurobiological differences of children's development, their closest caregivers, families, how neighborhoods and regions support and nurture children's development. And probably more so now than ever, sort of the global influences on children's development in terms of how connected we are around the globe now that, and those kinds of trends in the global environment also, impact on our children living in Prince George, living in New Aish, living in Haida Gwaii, living in Port Nelson, all, what's happening right now in Ukraine and other places around the world, all of that stuff is impacting on our children's development. And is, important in the First Nations Health Authority graphic to think about some of the environmental and cultural factors that also influence children's development. Thanks, Kate. The early years sector, so I'm just going to say a couple of words about some of the changes in the early years sector. So we've had quite a bit of activity of late in the earlier sector. So maybe Kate, just go along and I'll talk as we go. Oh yeah, COVID. There was something about a pandemic, or so obviously we're emerging into a new normal. What I want to say about that for young children is that the impact for families and children and being isolated, particularly for those children now entering into the system, into the education system and otherwise, their experience has been quite different with that isolation. As we're going to talk about when we look at the results a little bit, maybe that hasn't been entirely bad, but we do have to recognize that their peer-to-peer interaction and their ability to be out in the world and explore and discover has been more limited because of the pandemic. Some of the more specific shifts that we've experienced, excuse me, whatever, over the last few years. Number one, and I think about this, very specifically in Prince George, because I had the lovely opportunity to be there a few years ago and work with some of the folks with the Success by Six initiative. But since then, that initiative has been canceled, Success by Six and Children First, which has been a big loss for our province, because that was sort of the glue that held together many of the moving parts of the early years sector. And we've heard from lots of communities how the loss of that coordination function has really had an impact that hasn't been entirely positive. I know that you're also seeing in the north, the impact of a move to primary care networks and what that means in terms of the delivery of health services for young children and their families. We're moving towards universal childcare. There are all kinds of things that we have to struggle with in respect to that in terms of qualified staff and enough spaces and still affordability issues. But we have a strong movement in that direction, which to me has always been one of my dreams. I mean, why did we decide somewhere along the line that once a child turns 5 or 6, that publicly we should fund their education and care? When we know so much about the importance of the early years, why are we not publicly funding education and care for young children from the moment that they're born and supporting those families in whatever way makes sense to those families? So, the move to universal childcare, the new Ministry of Education and Childcare are such promising initiatives in respect to that. The BC Early Learning Framework, which really helps us think about the developmental and educational needs of children from 0 to 8. And then we have a new framework to support children with diverse needs. So if it's at this point just a framework, I don't see how we see that impacting on the ground quite yet, but the potential is there. So there has been a lot of policy shifts. Some of them not great, but lots of them moving in the direction that we would hope. This is, thanks to Kate, a beautiful slide that shows us how crazy the system of support for children in the early years is. And I'm always reluctant to even call it a system. And the policy development is fragmented across ministries provincially, health, education, Ministry of Children and Family Development, Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions all have a role to play for early childhood. And then how that plays out on the ground in terms of funding and service delivery is so uneven. It's just such a patchwork across the province. And I know the North, there is, less services in many ways. So it's the Northern system is, yes, fragmented in the same way, but also not delivering quite as many services on the ground. So, okay, that's it for me for a minute anyways, and I'm going to turn it over maybe to you, Caroline, to talk a little bit more about setting our contacts in the North with SEED.
Super, thank you. That's a nice introduction. It's lovely to see so many people here today. I'm going to keep it brief so we can catch up on a little time. And then, sorry, there's a tiny echo there somewhere, but I'm not sure where from. Hopefully we can manage to get rid of it. So in essence, what we wanted to do was just situate how we started, because people say, what is SEED? So SEED was an idea that came to pass after we did some work with the Human Early Learning Partnership. That was a program that we applied to from Prince George, that was a provincial program about compassionate leadership systems. And what that opportunity did was it allowed many of us to come together who'd never met each other before. And it was such an exciting and inviting space that we realized that we would need to work together if we were to think about what meaningful change could look like for children and youth. We specifically spoke to the early years piece, and it was just before Success by Six was dismantled. So what happened was the fact that then we decided that this was such an important area, and we really had some support at the time from the Chief Medical Officer from Northern Health, who was Sandra Allison. And what happened was the fact that spearheaded us to apply for a Michael Smith grant. So yes, the dirty word of research turns up. But actually, that's a really nice grant that allowed us to come together as a team. And it was drawing everybody in to be able to have a conversation. And there's many that I see here today who started out that work with us. And there are as many who have gone on to down other avenues. We then established a group, and we wanted to make sure that we could be inclusive and invite everybody in. So anybody who's interested in the early years can come and join in. It's not owned by any particular provider or professional group. And it's not to replace what happened with Success by Six, but it's to see if we can come together to mobilize to have a rapid future. So we developed a regional table action plan, and we have a small group that we meet several times a year, and we're open to getting anybody to come and join us. So we're not using this as a tout for business, but there's always an opportunity to come and join in. Can we move the slide on? So really our 4 objectives here is to make sure that we can collaborate and break down some of those barriers. Joanne's slide was, Kate's slide was fantastic in the fact that it showed all of those crazy arrows. And I really think that we can ask nicely and map that kind of image for the North too. And there are lots of crazy arrows in the North. So we have to collaborate if we're going to bring about some sorts of change. We want to build partnerships, because all too often we worked out that actually we stay in our silos and we don't actually understand other people's worlds. And the moment we open those doors, we let in an opportunity of new knowledge, learning, conversation, listening. It's just fabulous. We also wanted to think about, well, what are the short-term issues to mid-term to long-term? And what are those priorities? And how do we align some of our priorities? Because we all know from every organization that we come from, somebody somewhere has a priority. So let's have a look at how they overlap, so that by doing work together, we can fulfill the needs for everybody's priorities. And what we wanted to do was create a sustainable dissemination approach, so that, when the world turns and things change, we are hopeful that if we can build enough energy in this space, then what will happen is we can keep this going, and it's not dependent on some of those systems. For example, Success by Six was funded by the Ministry of Children and Families. Then what will happen is it's not lost into the archives of history. Next slide. So really our first event was the fact that, COVID came along, as Joanne said, and I remember sitting outside Nesdeo having a conversation with Joanne about the fact that we were no longer able to do our planned event as a person-to-person event, and we had to switch and do it online. And what we did was we brought everybody together, and it changed how we started off. And I think with hindsight, it was great. As what we did was we opened the forum. Please go and have a look on our Seed website. You'll see that we keep the archives of everything that we're doing. And we had a virtual education week, and it was great. And we had lots of workshops and lots of lectures and some great people doing presentations for us. So it was wonderful, and it's still there and it's still useful. So please do go have a look. We also then really wanted from the summit, oh no, it's okay, you can go to the next one. From the summit, we also made sure that we fulfilled the responsibilities of making sure that we published what we did, and we generated a working group. So we have the website. I'm sorry, I've plugged it 3 times now. We have a biannual newsletter that we send out, which, you know, we have a little archive of maybe 3 so far, but of course it will grow. So ask us in a decade and we'll have more. We've built a regional advisory table, and we have representatives from every sector, which is just, it fills my soul with joy. And we've also started to explore some new research partnerships, as we recognise that it will be through research that we'll be able to generate some money to be able to start to be part of the change. So we can go to the next slide. We also developed what we thought would be a good strategic plan in partnership with everybody. Is we developed a mission, and we think, I've started to think about how our partnerships are important, where are our core values and beliefs, and as you can see, they sit here as collaborative partnership, the fact that we want to draw on child and family centred care, we will pay attention to justice, equity, diversity and inclusion. We're mindful of cultural humility. We want a Northern voice, and we want to think about something that links to sustainability. We ended up with 5 key action areas, as you can see. Would we love to change the systems? Absolutely. Do we have a magic wand? No. So we'll have to do it like everybody else, slowly and one step at a time. We recognise that mental health doesn't arrive as a challenge for us with our youth. It starts in the early years, and we need to advocate for that. Our third action area is early childhood development measures. Where are they? What are they? How do we understand them? And how do we use them? It was a great conversation that we've had. And that's why the help are here today, to be able to speak to that piece. We also have had some work from and questions from the teams in the more strongly in the education department in relation to learning opportunities. And we need to pay attention to what that is so that we can all learn together, and to create a knowledge hub and showcase really what we do. We know we do great things in the North. Sometimes we're so busy getting on with it, we forget to share it. And so many others could learn from the work that we do. So it's about finding courage and time to be able to showcase what we do. Next slide. So today, this is our next step. It's about early childhood development measures and thinking about the data. And we know that data can be emotive, as Joanne spoke to it before. So please do remember to look at the Padlet, because one of the things we'd love to hear from you is, how does it make you feel? So that we can collect this information real time, so that we can pay attention to how everybody is both arriving and will be leaving from here today. Don't think there's any more slides from me.
Okay, back to me, I think. So primarily today, we're going to talk about the early development instrument, which is the instrument completed by kindergarten teachers on the children in their class. But just to remind folks that, you know, the EDI is one tool within a child development monitoring system at HELP that starts with, you know, understanding how our toddlers are doing, and then carries on through collecting information about childhood experiences, and then collecting information in the later years, grade 4, 8, and now into the secondary years on students' well-being and health with the MDI and the YDI. EDI, you know, it's been around for a long time, so I'm guessing lots of you know about it. It is a questionnaire of a little over 200 items and filled out by teachers February of the school year on every child in their class. And it has items in each of those 5 domains or scales of development, their physical health and well-being, language and cognitive development, communication skills, and then emotional maturity and social competence. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit. I'm going to try to be brief, so we have lots of time to dig into local data, just about what we've learned from our Wave 8 data, which was released in the fall of 2022 and does represent 20 years of data in BC. So you can see that over time, we've collected information on over 300,000 children. And so, you know, it's the population health data is different than sort of random samples or representative data. It really is much more like a census, much more like capturing all of the children. There are reasons we don't capture all of the children, but it really is more like a census of children rather than what you might think of as a sort of typical research sample. You can see there were 40,000 plus children in the last wave, Wave 8, which the data was collected between September 2019 and 2022. Oh, there you go. And thank you, Kate. The Wave 8 data collection took place over those 3 years. And as you can see there, the pandemic obviously arrived sort of halfway through the wave. And so we're thinking about what that impact of that was. And you can see there that we had 88% of children, schools, teachers participate in the data collection. Okay, so just to say a word for those of you who don't know about when we talk about children being vulnerable, and vulnerable is kind of a loaded word. I've often thought over my time at HELP that it would have been nice in some ways to have chosen a different word, but we didn't. And so, so we live with it. But vulnerability is really a statistical determination based on children who, you know, score in the bottom 10% of the range of scores. And it was set as a cutoff many years ago now to allow us to monitor over time how children were doing. We do know that, you know, through linkage that we did over time, that children who show as vulnerable on the EDI, we link to later educational outcomes and can see that they are more likely to have challenges over time and to, you know, struggle within the system. You can see there beginning in the second wave of data collection, right through to the most recent, that, you know, 29.9%, up to, sorry, I have to move our little box so I can see the right-hand side of the trend line, up to around 33% of children in Wave 8. You can see really since Wave 5, so around 2011 beginning, that we really have been thinking about 1/3 of children vulnerable in some aspect of their development. You know, and always when I say that and when I know about what that data means, I have to stop and remind myself, this isn't a number. This is about children, 1/3 of children in British Columbia who we are not supporting in the way that we should be in order to maximize their opportunity and their potential. So I never want to forget when we get into these percentages that this is about real lives of children and families. So in Wave 8, we were at that 1 in 3 percentage of children behind where we would like them to be in some aspect of their development. And you can see from this map that the darker the area, the higher the percentage of children within that vulnerable range. So, you know, going back to one of the original slides that we had in terms of helps, you know, raison d'etre, I suppose, is about understanding the differences that make a difference. We have a geographic variability. We have a topography of opportunity. I often think of it as that depending on where you live in the province, your opportunities, the quality of your experiences in the early years can be quite different. And so you can see that on this map in terms of the darker and lighter places. The big gray place in the far north, by the way, many of you will know that, that's the Stikine School District, and there are too few children, largest geographic school district in the province, but too few children to actually report out for us. So those numbers are always suppressed. You can see that there's been a range. So we have some places, some districts in the province where 22% of children were in that vulnerable range, up to over 70%, 72% of children. And then at the neighborhood level, so as you'll see, as Kate digs into the northern data, each of the school districts is broken up into neighborhoods. So at the neighborhood level, that range, that topography of opportunity is even larger. And I often say, you know, think about as a kindergarten teacher, if you're in a classroom where 13% of children are behind where you would like them to be, compare that to what that would be like in terms of, you know, 50% of more of children in that kindergarten class starting behind where you would want them to be. And it just helps us understand how that vulnerability compounds over time. So next one. Okay, we are, you know, part of, as we talked about a bit earlier, only thinking about vulnerability is never going to set right with our hearts. I suppose that's one way of thinking about it, right? Like, we know that every child, whether they're in the vulnerable range or not, every child has strengths. Every child has gifts and beautiful things about them. And so we really added some new metrics to this year's Wave 8 outcomes in terms of trying to understand when children were doing well, they're on track, or in that sort of middle range where they're not vulnerable or on track, but sort of influx, what we talk about as influx. So you can see here, we're going to just walk you through this. This is what we saw on the earlier trend line in terms of the percentage of children the influx and on track children. You can see, and it's an important thing to remember, we don't want to get stuck on just talking about vulnerability because more children are on track than are behind where we would want them to be. And there's a big proportion of children in that middle range as well. So really wanting to think about not only the vulnerable end of things, but what are the things that, you know, support children to be resilient and to be on track. I had the chance to go to the Mental Health in Schools conference last week. Was that last week? Seems eons ago. And Michael Unger was one of the speakers, and he has got some amazing research on resilience and why children can do well even in the face of adversity. So lots to be thinking about there. You can see there's been not a ton of change at that top end. It's gone down a little bit. So as the vulnerabilities rate risen a bit over time, with the children on track has gone from 46.1% in the wave 2 to 45.4% over the province in the most recent wave. So relatively stable on that end of things. I was going to say too, one thing that I was going to say, I don't think it's coming up again, but just before we get into the scale by scale, we were kind of surprised by the overall provincial vulnerability this year in Wave 8. We actually thought that the impact of the pandemic would be more to the negative than it was. So it was an interesting thing for us to think about. We don't know why entirely the trend has been relatively stable over time, but a couple of the things that we have been thinking about. Number one is because of the pandemic, there's never been, you know, the level of income support for families that we had through CERB, through some of the other pandemic related income initiatives. We know that, you know, family income level is a huge predictor of childhood outcomes. And, you know, it's probably the thing that if we think about how can we make a difference, providing families with enough money to care for their children and themselves is going to be a big factor. And with SERVE and some of the other financial initiatives through the pandemic, we were, that happened in a very big way. So that may be a factor. The other thing that we've heard from lots of families, and I certainly hear this from families in my community, is they had more opportunity to spend time with their children. So sometimes families can get so busy with work and soccer and figure skating and, all the things that sometimes families are running around like, chickens with their head off, frankly. And with the pandemic, there was a bit more time at home. Whether that was a factor for some children, maybe. As I say, we don't know, but it was really important for us when we looked at the Wave 8 data, we expected a big rise in vulnerability that we didn't see. So my bias is more connected to the income initiatives. And I think we hopefully have learned something that if we actually do give people money in their pocket, it makes a difference to how kids are doing. Quickly, see, I said it was going to be quick, Kate, and I haven't been that quick. Better yet. So these are the scale by scale results over time. So you saw previously, we have the language and cognitive development, communication skills, physical health and well-being, and social emotional development. So over time, the lowest contribution of vulnerability has been from the language and cognitive development scale. And you can see it's bounced around a bit. It's the pink one. Thanks, Kate. But it has stayed less vulnerable than the other scales. It's the scale that I think about as sort of the traditional ABCs of school readiness: reading, writing, arithmetic, those kinds of things. So children, if there's a bright spot in how BC's children have been doing, this would be it. It's in their language and cognitive development. The next one is the communication skills and general knowledge. The orange one has been very flat over time, really changed very little. We do see often in some of the districts where there's a higher proportion of children who are English language learners, a little bit higher vulnerability on that scale because of it does have items about children's communication in English. And then the physical health and well-being scale, the green one on this trend, has gone up quite a bit over time, which is concerning in some ways. It is the scale that we have seen over time tends to track more with socioeconomic status. So, I think we all know that socioeconomic status impacts on children's development, but interestingly, the social and emotional, or sort of the well-being aspects of children's development, bounce around a little bit more. They're not as closely tied to that socioeconomic gradient, whereas the physical health and well-being one is. It has questions about, does the child come to school tired? Do they have their lunch? Those kinds of things that are often connected to family income level. And then the scales at the top, social emotional well-being, have been the highest level of vulnerability for the last 3-4 waves. Now, these are the domains that if children are doing less well, the potential for later mental health concerns can come from that area. So it is, to me, if we think about children as kind of the canaries in the mine, and if we think about mental health and the impact that it's having in our culture now, those are probably the most worrying trends that I see. Oh, thank you, Kate. So hopefully I just said that if you got mental health conditions by age 14, and really different patterns for early internalizing and externally. So this is a study done by some of our colleagues at Help Martin Goon, Anna Gatterman, among others. So just again, emphasizing the link to early outcomes to later how kids are doing. I talked about the physical health and well-being trend, and that it has been trending in the wrong direction, but this was an interesting finding going back to what I was talking about. So on the subscale, each of the scales has a subscale. And I'm sure you'll all be grateful to know that we're not going to tell you about all of these things to really make your mind go crazy. But the physical health and well-being, that one about physical readiness for the school day, we actually saw improvement. And physical readiness for the school day is that one that says, is the child tired? Do they come to school on time? Do they have a coat? Those kinds of things. And again, maybe because some families had more money in their pockets, we saw that that really had a positive trend in the last round of data collection. There we go. Here's our summary of key findings. Still 1 in 3 children are behind where we would want them to be in some aspect of their development. We know that that early vulnerability will track. Continuing to have the social competence and emotional maturity scales as the highest concern, and the variability in overall vulnerability rates across the province remains. Both regional disparities as well as within regions, big differences in how children are doing. And we'll talk more about that when we get into the northern findings.
And then Joanne, these are you talked a bit about these. I don't know if we want to skip through.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think, but yeah, I did talk about the stable trend. Would like to think about that there are some policy and investment supports of children that are making a difference. You know, HELP over the years has had a fairly significant impact, I think, on some government policy in these areas. Certainly in the early days, you know, that all the strong starts were allocated on the basis of HELP results, all, you know, early childcare operating funds. There was lots of ways that we were influencing. And again, now I think the work that, you know, Paul Kershaw and others have done around the importance of universal childcare, these things have started to make a difference. And I think we have more conversations with government now than ever. And hopefully those will lead to the continued kinds of policy development that we would support. Talked about CERB, childcare benefit, the extension of parental leave to 18 months. These are also all things that we have recommended over time. So, you know, I think the sort of take home that I'll leave you with on this front is, from a health perspective, we want to partner with those of you in regions and communities, as I said earlier, using the data to give voice. And we use the data to give voice provincially, and we hope that we're able to partner with you to use the data to give voice closer to where you live. The recent BC Child Poverty Report Card, again, just confirming that potentially what happened over the period of the pandemic made a difference for children. That went from 1 in 8 BC children living in poverty down significantly from 1 in 5, which had been stable for several years within the BC Poverty Report Card. So it'll be really interesting to see the next one that comes out, the Poverty Report Card, to see if that number will go back to what it was. And then we'll know for sure that things like CERB have made a big difference. So I think that's it for me, isn't it?
That's it. I'll take it over from here.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah, we'll keep going. I know it's lots of information, but let's keep going, and then we'll create some space for discussion.
Yeah, I think what we'll do, I'll do some now reviewing of Northern regional trends. And I'm going to highlight a new tool that we are using now to report out EDI data at the community and neighborhood level, the EDI data dashboard. I'm going to bounce a bit back and forth. Joanne, I'm going to ask that maybe you make sure that I have stopped talking by like 10 after, quarter after 12, the latest.
Okay.
So we have some time.
Well,
Okay?
look at the time. I
I
talked
know.
way too long. Sorry, Kate.
We're just chatting.
Jeez.
We're just getting the information out. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is bounce actually out of the slides and hope that you will see the data dashboard in real time. Do you see that?
Yeah, looks
Yeah.
good.
Great. So this is our new tool for exploring EDI data. I'm just going to highlight some of the features and then bounce kind of back and forth. One of the big exciting things is that you can search by boundary type, and you can see there's a whole variety of boundary types that you can search by. So school district, neighborhood level, health authority levels, MCFD levels, which is a new way for us to be reporting, and folks like you on this call can play with the data as you see fit. And what we are hoping to do today is give you a little bit of a sample, paint a bit of a picture when I go back to the slides about what are those regional trends, so that when you do your own exploring, after you are a little more familiar with the dashboard, you'll have that context to understand them with. So just noting that you can search by boundary, and I'm just going to pull up a northern school district so we can play in real time, and it's going to disconnect from the server, but not to worry, it will come back. It's been sitting for a minute, so here it goes. And when you begin, you'll get a little walkthrough about how to use it. I'm not going to take that walkthrough, but you can, as you're getting used to using the dashboard. So if we select a school district here, you can notice that these are the modules within the dashboard. You can look at demographics, and I'm going to pull it, just point that out right now. So Joanne mentioned that Wave 8 data was collected over 3 years, one a pre-pandemic year, just before the WHO declared the pandemic, and 2 pandemic years. So when you're looking at your community school district level data, this is something to know. When did your school district collect that data? So you can see for Bulkley Valley that it's collects 2 of the 3 years in a wave. And that depends on the size of the district. Smaller districts participate more in data collection over a 3-year wave of data collection than larger districts that tend to participate just once. And then you can see, we talked already about how we're trying to introduce some the spread of overall outcomes. So yes, we talk about what's the vulnerability rate for this school district, but we also give the percentage for influx and for on track. You can see a map of that district. You can see where the school district's vulnerability rate falls within those ranges that Joanne talked about, from low to high. And so Bulkley Valley on the higher side. And then the trend line for that district in red against the gray here background for the BC trend. So you can see Bulkley Valley has jumped around a little bit, been at or above the province overall. And these little icons here say whether we consider that helped to be a meaningful change over time. So in this case, we see that there's been a meaningful increase. This is what these mean, a meaningful increase in vulnerability, both over the long and short term. And all of this information, there's information icons, there's lots of good detail in here that you can explore on your own. Going down, you'll see that there's scale outcomes that you can click through. And then in understanding what are the communities within this school district. So we talk about these as neighborhoods, help neighborhoods, but in the north, we realize that many of them are not neighborhoods per se, as communities spread out across. And then looking at what are the neighborhoods within this school district, their vulnerability rates, and noting that when I hover over, so we see here that in Bulkley Valley, there are 2 communities, Houston and Smithers. Houston having a high vulnerability here of 53.2% for wave 8. And when you hover over this bar, you are able to see that vulnerability rate, but also the number of children that represents. So in Houston, we're looking at a vulnerability rate of 53.2, and that represents 42 children in that neighborhood. We call a neighborhood at help. I'm going to do some more digging. This is going to make more sense as I go, but I just wanted to play with this in real time. The other thing I want to point out while we're here is the resources that are available. So we have a technical guide for lots more. If you don't know what you're looking at, you can find out more. The provincial synthesis information that Joanne just talked about. We have a PowerPoint template. So in this case, you can download a series of slides, and then you can actually put in your own data from your district, and it helps you with notes about how to think about the storytelling if you want to take information from the dashboard and do your own presentation on EDI data. So that's just to give you a little highlight. Now I'm going to go back to the slides, which I hope I am doing right now. Yeah. Great. So back to sort of now I'm going to step to the broader story. We did a little bit into one district, but now stepping back a bit to give some context. So the first highlight is that across health authorities, there's variability in EDI vulnerability rates in BC health authorities. So here we see a list of the health authorities and their associated vulnerability rates for wave 8, and they're put in order. So you see that Northern Health has the highest vulnerability rate of the other 5 districts at 37%, and that the range goes from 30.9% from Interior Health up to 37%. This is a screenshot from the dashboard. This is for Northern Health. So this is like, what are we talking about when we say Northern Health boundaries? This is what they are, and you can play around with this in the dashboard. It's also, so again, here now we're in that health region. It's going to talk about the vulnerability rate for the region and where that, where Northern Health sits in amongst those other similar boundary types. So here it is with the other health authorities, noting that Northern is on the highest end of that range. We see the trend line over time for the Northern District as a whole being slightly above BC over time consistently. So now we're going back to that same list of health authorities, but now what we're doing is adding the number of children, both in terms of how many children had an EDI completed for them by their kindergarten teacher over the wave 8 period, and the number vulnerable. And so this is highlighting that the vulnerability rates are important, but also when you add in the number of children, it kind of changes the order of which health authorities are standing out. So in this case, when you add the number of kids, because Fraser Health is such a large region in terms of kindergarten kids, the number of kids vulnerable, even though the vulnerability rate is lower, is higher. So they've come into that sort of first place position of the most number of kids vulnerable. And Northern Health drops to the 5th, the least number of kids vulnerable. And then switching now to this idea of what percent are on track in all 5 areas of development to focus on the strengths. And you can see one of the interesting things, there's more of a gap from 37% to 30% in vulnerability, and less of a gap when we get to these on track trends. And Joanne mentioned that. So here we see that Fraser Health, about 45.9% of kids on track on all 5 areas of development, both the highest number and the highest percentage of kids on track. And that for all health authority regions, there are more kids on track than vulnerable. So that's something to hold on to as we go forward. So highlight number 2 is that there are within the health borders, there are subregions. And so we see there continues to be variability in the vulnerability rates in those subregions, with Northwest having the highest wave 8 vulnerability rate and Northern Interior the highest number of kids vulnerable. So here we see what that means and what it looks like on the dashboard. But when we break down we're still now using health boundaries, Northwest, Northern Interior, Northeast, and then the vulnerability rates here. And these are the trend lines when we map them all together. So similar trend lines to what we've been showing before. Going up is a worst case scenario, going down is vulnerability getting better. And so what you can see here is that the blue line, Northwest, has been consistently above BC overall, which is this red line here. So Northwest region consistently above and getting worse over time. We see Northern Interior kind of at the BC trends, but getting a bit worse over time. And then Northeast starting off a bit higher than BC overall and getting better over time. So again, forward. So again, when we put these in an order, we see Northwest standing out as the highest vulnerability rate. But when we add the number of kids, what's standing out is that it's a different subregion that has the most number of kids. Just because there are more kindergarten children living in Northern Interior, we see that Northern Interior has the most number of kids. I'm going to keep playing back and forth with this. I hope this is making sense for folks. And if there's questions, please stop us or ask questions in the chat at any time. So the third highlight, Northern region vulnerability trends across all 5 scales have been higher than the province over time, with 2 scales in particular standing out: physical health and well-being and emotional maturity. And these are just screen shots from the dashboard again. trends over time at that scale level, noting that the circle here is physical health and well-being. And you can just see here's the BC is gray, is the gray line on all of these different charts. And in this case, physical health and well-being, the green line is showing where Northern Health is in relation to BC overall. So slightly higher in the physical health and well-being scale than BC over time. And slightly similar with emotional maturity and language and cognition as well. Okay, so there are 11 school districts in the northern region. And this is, we're trying to give a bit of a flavor for things, but there's, you all know the north is wide. There's lots and lots of communities represented. So with those 11 school districts, the range in vulnerability goes from 24.6% at the low end to 72% at the highest end. And we're not going to be able to unpack everything, but we're just going to pick up on a few places to talk a bit more about them. And the first one we're going to pick up on is Haida Gwaii. We know that Haida Gwaii, certainly folks that are from that neighborhood and have looked to EDI data might have noticed that Haida Gwaii is the highest, on the highest end of the school district vulnerability rates at 72%. And what I'm going to do is come back to the slide, but I'm going to bounce back out to the dashboard, because let's just take a look here at what so I'm going to just demonstrate some of the exploring you might want to do as you're looking through your own school district trends. What might you look to when you see something like this, 72%? I'm sure it feels concerning. That's a lot of children in the school district. But the one thing to note right off the bat, when you look at the trend line across time, you see that it wasn't always the case that Haida Gwaii was so high. It hasn't been consistently high like this. It has bounced around a little bit higher in wave 2, but then has been fairly close, tracking fairly closely to the province overall. But we can see that there's been over the long and short term, a meaningful increase. So one thing I want to do is go up to demographics, noting that this has been the data is collected over 3 years. You can see that Haida Gwaii, being a smaller district, collects across all 3 years of that data collection period. But still, when we look to the number of children that were in the full over those 3 years, just 50 children were part of that data collection. And now I'm just going to show you how you can play with this. So not only can you choose boundary types, but you can choose waves. And so you can decide to click through to just get a sense. What was the demographics like in wave 7? Note that we're up to 95 kids. And in fact, if you just click through, you can watch the change on the map. And you can also look to demographics to see how things have changed over those waves. And so what I'm trying to point out here with Haida Gwaii is that for the most part, the number of kids has been in and around 70, 80 to 100. But for wave 8, it's the lowest it has been at 50 kids. So that's something to note. In other words, when you have a smaller number of kids, if there's a few kids with high vulnerability, that can really shift how the vulnerability trends are when you're talking about such small numbers of kids. And also, Joanne pointed out that the participation rate for wave 8 data collection was 88%, which is very good. Wave 7, it was 96%. So in wave 8, we did have some communities with less participation than we have seen in other years. And that certainly makes sense. BC was the only region in the country to collect data at all through the EDI, because other places in the country do collect EDI data in that 2020-2021 school year. So it's just to note that giving an example of some of the things you might look to if you see a trend like this, and remembering that trends over time, yes, they are pointing in a direction, but this may be just a moment in time for Haida Gwaii. Okay, coming back to the slides. I don't know if there's anybody from Haida Gwaii that wants to have a comment or a question about that. But you can just interrupt if you do. And I'll rely on Erica to see if there's hands up or unmuting. Great. So coming back to that slide, one thing I didn't do, but if you were to click around in Haida Gwaii to look at the scale levels, physical health and well-being coming up as the highest scale in terms of wave 8 vulnerability. And one thing that is on that that you can play with too in the dashboard is looking at multiple vulnerabilities. So this this graph is showing what percentage of children are vulnerable on just one area of the EDI, what percentage are vulnerable on 2, 3, 4, or all 5 of the scales. So you can see, just noting here that over time, the number of children that are vulnerable on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the scales has gone up in Haida Gwaii. So for this year, but it looks a bit different than the other years. But this is something else that you can find information about on the dashboard. Okay. So of the 11 school districts, 3 had meaningful decreases in vulnerability over time. So we see here Fort Nelson, long-term decrease and being below the provincial over time overall. Peace River South, also seeing a meaningful decrease in vulnerability over the long and the short term. And Peace River North, kind of starting off at the province level, getting a little higher, but now heading in the right direction and getting better over time. Okay,
5 more minutes. 5 more
Great.
minutes.
We're close. Good. Okay, so now I just want to give a little example, now getting into what we call neighborhoods, although as I mentioned, in the north, it might be more like communities. And HELP neighborhoods were established based on a few things: census blocks, postal code boundaries, city planning boundaries, geographic features, and in consultation with communities to make sure that the way that we're setting them up makes sense for folks that use the data. And so when we say neighborhood, it could vary where you are from, and hopefully it makes sense as we talk about it. But the highlight here is that 5 northern region neighborhoods are in the top 10 list of BC neighborhoods with highest wave 8 vulnerability rates. So of the top 10, 5 are northern. 4 of those neighborhoods have had vulnerability rates of 40% or higher over all or most of the waves. So persistent vulnerability. However, when we start to add in the number of kids, only 1 northern neighborhood is in that top 10 number of kids vulnerable. Okay, so what does that look like? So here's the list of top vulnerability rates. And so if we're in the top 10, we see Haida Gwaii, these are neighborhoods. So in Prince George, the South Fort George, the Bowl neighborhood, Houston in Bulkley Valley, Prince Rupert, which is both a neighborhood and a school district because it's small enough that we don't have subregions in Prince Rupert, and Fort St. James in Nechako Lake, making up the 1 to 10 list. And then not far off is Quesnel West. So just taking a look, a little bit, an example of what you would see on the dashboard again, seeing that the vulnerability rates, seeing that Prince Rupert in this case has been consistently higher than the province overall, with those high vulnerability rates persistently overall over time. And then it's on the very high end in terms of vulnerability rates. Okay, now adding the number of kids. I know we're bouncing back and forth a lot, but here we are now adding the number of kids. And when we do that, only 1 neighborhood in the north is in the top 10. It's number 6, and that's Terrace with Coast Mountain School District. So Terrace, with a vulnerability rate still on the higher side of 43%, has 107 kids who are vulnerable because of the number of kids in that live in that area. When we look, you see the next one, the next northern neighborhood down is much further down. We're getting into the 31st one, the 43rd in terms of position in the list of number of kids vulnerable. Is this making sense? I'm hoping.
It does, but Kate, there's a question in the chat.
Please, fire it.
And so instead of relying on absolute numbers, could it help to have the number of vulnerable children weighted for the total population of children in each district? I'm just wondering if there has been any work to do that weighting with the population.
That's a great question. So we do know that all or most school districts participate in data collection. And we know that 88% participation rate represents that 88% of kids who are in those public schools have had a kindergarten teacher complete an EDI for them. So the vast majority of kids, but certainly there are schools that are other independent First Nation schools. We do get a handful of independent and First Nation schools that participate in EDI data collection, but not all. So there are certainly kids missing. And I appreciate this question because we do want to say not all kids are captured in this data collection. And we're actually working now trying to unpack, but it's trickier than you would think. What are the actual number of 5-year-olds compared to public school numbers? And we use Ministry of Education numbers, and they do track kids that are homeschooled, kids that are in independent schools. So we're having a better understanding of what those participation rates really look like, and are moving forward a bit with that. But for Wave 8, we didn't get into the details of that yet. Joanne, I don't know if you have something further.
No, I think that's very, very thorough, Kate. Just Caroline put a sort of add-on question about homeschooling in the chat as well. So just to respond to that, as Kate said, you know, those are part of the whole population of the community, and we're really trying to get a good number of that. Homeschooling kids do not participate in EDI because there isn't a teacher who's had enough time with them to complete the instrument. So while we're trying to get them as part of the denominator in terms of the total population of the community, you won't see them in the EDI results.
But the other thing to note, there was definitely a blip in homeschooling over that first year back. So I'm getting all my years mixed up. But what was that? The 2020-2021 school year, when there was more kids being homeschooled, but it's gone pretty, according to the Ministry of Education, most kids are going back into schools. That was a blip when people were nervous to send their kids into the school system, but most kids are back in school. Okay, I'm gonna flip through.
It's quarter.
Yeah, I'm flipping through. Don't look. There's quite a bit. I'm getting to this slide. Here's my summary slide. Okay, so if we were to unpack more at the neighborhood level, and we can share these slides, and you can see that, and including some notes in there about what are the patterns that we noticed at the neighborhood level. Overall, we definitely can see Northern BC has higher vulnerability rates than other regions in Wave 8. And there are some northern communities that have experienced persistently high rates over time. And so by identifying both vulnerability rates and the number of children, we are trying to demonstrate there's a bit more nuance to the story. That HELP has in the past advocated for something called a proportionate universality approach to addressing vulnerability, meaning that it's important to have universal programs like childcare. You know, our HELP has definitely been a champion of this idea of universal childcare. It's exciting that it's trying to make its way, so that are available to all children, but that it's certainly some populations need more targeted supports than others. And we see that in the north with these clusters of communities that have had persistently high vulnerability. And now we're seeing over 20 years, the urgency is there. Yeah, just noting that partly based on lack of resources and some other analysis that we have around, and that Joanne referenced around the relationship between EDI vulnerability and the socioeconomic status of families and neighborhoods. Maybe we'll be able to get into those, maybe we won't, but that there is evidence to say there's more targeted approaches are needed in certain areas. And maybe we'll pause here. Yeah, and just have a moment of questions. I'm going to jump to our question slide. Don't look.
Thanks, Kate.
We tried to cover way too much, but here's our questions. Yes, we're wondering if people want to turn a camera on or just hop on around what's standing out for you. Do these data reflect the experiences that you've had over this period?
Maybe we can take the slide down just for a minute, Kate, and then we can see at least a few more people. Be nice to see some more faces. Taru, you asked, did you speak in?
Yeah, you know, thank you so much. These are very fantastic data. I'm actually pleasantly surprised to see. Sorry, my computer freezes me, but I know you can still hear me.
Yeah, no problem.
So the reason I asked that question is that I think it is as rich as it is. It can be a bit misleading in some ways. So, for example, when you see the changes where you report absolute numbers, in my view, it can sort of like skew how you actually interpret the data, right? Because the northern regions, we have smaller populations. So if you actually have a weighted, say, for example, a column where you actually have the absolute number of kids, but then you have a column of weighted by the population, and you anchor that to that population, I suspect that these trends will show, like most of these regions in the north, absolutely above the provincial averages, which is an important thing for people that are making decisions, because when they see, oh, the actual numbers make Adigwai lower, then people will sort of like, oh, it's not that a big of a problem. Whereas in fact, when you weight it to the total population of each district, it will probably shoot out, you know, and that becomes an important thing to demonstrate when you do the weighting. So for example, if we give an example of where you see Fraser Valley is number one in vulnerability, but also number one in kids that are doing well, it's because we are reporting absolute numbers. But if we reported weighted numbers, Fraser Valley would be number one in kids doing well, I think. And then we'll probably be least, we have the least vulnerable kids, which to me, I think is also important. But thank you so much for all of this data. This is a fantastic work. Thank you.
Thanks, Taru. Yeah, just to agree, 100%. Thank you. Marian, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think some of you are coming from a provincial or a regional perspective, and I'm in one single community that we've seen up on the screen, Houston, and we're not looking so great. And you know, the data is helpful in that we can advocate and do all of those pieces that we've been doing for years. I think it's interesting to see that we've gotten worse since Success by Six and Children First vanished. You know, in those small communities, that's set up and that coordination worked incredibly well. I know it didn't work everywhere, worked incredibly well in our small communities and in other communities as well. And the loss of that is significant. I also think when I'm looking at this, and again, I'm looking at it from this community perspective, yeah, it's not surprising at all that we're up at 53%. You know, 10 or 15 years ago, when children were, you know, identified in the early years as needing some extra assistance, say at age 2, then they would go about and get that, and it would be in place within 6 months. Now we've got families who are identifying something at 2 or 3, and it's taking 3 years to get an autism assessment. And then, so they're not getting any of those, well, they are getting some services in the early years, not the ones that they need. And then they're in the school system before they've got anything in place. And that to me is significant, because the early years has and still does amazing work with kids and can make a difference in those early years. But we're really hooped at the moment. We can't, the services up here are non-existent sometimes. The assessments are appalling, you know, and for those really vulnerable families, no, they can't just hop on a plane to Vancouver to get that assessment and pay $3,500. We've got a dire situation up here, and we need to talk about the north, but the north needs to be on the map provincially, because those assessments are really making a difference in not a good way for families up here.
Great. Thanks, Marian. Just a couple of quick comments about that, just to go back to your original comment about the loss of the Success by Six coordination. That's something that we're hearing a lot around the province. You know, in the absence of there being an early childhood system, the function of those coordinating folks was to kind of create a system, try to create that coherence, and that you know, has been lost. And so that's been a huge factor. And I really want to celebrate the work of SEED, because I think that's so much of what SEED is trying to do. And then just very briefly, in respect to your comment about lack of services and long wait lists, you know, Kate put up that little graphic there at the end about, you know, the questions of equity and equality. And I, you know, certainly from a northern perspective, you know, there needs to be more thinking about. It's not just a matter of allocating services based on population, how do we really factor in distance and challenge and all of those kinds of things? I was in a meeting yesterday where somebody from Berkeley Valley was there talking about the scope of their, range of their child development services all the way up to Atlan, and how does that get accounted for those kinds of, huge geographies. So thank you for those comments. Philip.
Just find my buttons there. So, sorry, you've got me in my garden today because it's too nice to be in the office.
Nice.
So my previous role, sorry, I'm a nurse by background. In my previous role, and still to some extent is currently, is supporting children with chronic and complex health needs, which is actually quite a small population comparatively to children with other needs. Often I find they're missed because they're such a small population, but with a high level of need. And so I'm just wondering, how are they captured in the EDI data? And how would they show up in that data? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. Kate, do you want to take that one?
Sure. When we use Ministry of Education demographics when people fill out the EDI. So if a child comes into the school system with a designation, with a disability identified, we would see that indicated. And when we report out, you can look on the dashboard. It does have the percentage of now I'm saying that, I'm going to check it right now. Yes, right. Special needs. Yes, we do identify it on the dashboard. It's new tool, so I'm getting from reminding myself. But we will say the percentage and the actual number of children in that district that were identified as a special need. But we also know that lots of kids will show up at school not yet having the just everything that Marion was saying, not yet having had the diagnosis or the supports to identify who they are, and so they might not be identified by the time the EDI gets completed for them by their teacher in kindergarten. So they are part of this sample insofar as if they're participating in public schools.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add to that, thanks, Kate, that because kids with chronic and complex needs will be designated in kindergarten. They're probably the primary population that is designated in kindergarten, because other children who may get designation later for what I would call more sort of invisible needs like autism or those kinds of things, they're often not designated in kindergarten, but kids with chronic and complex health care needs are. And so they do show up in that data in the way that Kate's describing it. So thanks, Philip. I know we only have a couple more minutes left. I see Erica's note about adding questions to the Padlet, and I know that Kate and I would be most helpful. Well, I don't know that we'd be most helpful. We'd be most willing to try to be helpful in answering those questions if you put them in. So I don't know, Kate, do we want to go just to that 5 things that might matter slide as a way of finishing?
Yep.
And then we'll turn it back to Seed.
And I also want to say that we have spoken to Seed to say that we're happy to come back. We knew there was going to be a lot of information to share, which there was. So we're happy to come back to a future meeting if there is a desire to have more conversation and more questions and space for that, maybe in a smaller group or what have you.
So just briefly, these are 5 things that over the time of help, working with communities, we see that this is the potential for make a difference. So, and I, as I'm saying them, I'm like, oh yeah, well, Seed's working on that, Seed's working on that. So I feel so it's strong intersectoral leadership. So really bringing people from health, MCFG, school system, nonprofits, everybody coming together in an intersectoral way makes a difference. A focus on research. So not only EDI, but certainly EDI is one component of that, but other local research. Very important in alignment between the school system and really thinking about how can we build a system that is from birth to adolescence, that really flows through from birth to adolescence, not have that, artificial break when children go into kindergarten. So how do we align those sectors? Focus on barriers, which again, I think Seed has done a lot of that work, and Kate and I would be most happy to chat more about that whole idea about how do we think about barriers and proportionate universality, and then very much a commitment to strong advocacy, strong voice. And maybe one more, Kate, because I want to get the commercial for Compassionate Systems in. Caroline mentioned we did some work with Compassionate Systems in Prince George a few years ago now. The Ministry of Education has recently invested more heavily in that work. For me, looking at this difficult data for all these years, knowing that it is a reflection of the inadequacy of the systems that are supporting children, how do we focus on creating the kinds of systems that really better nest and support children and families? And so really moving to thinking about building leadership of ourselves. How are we reflective? How do we think about how we show up? How do we build strong connections with each other and with the folks that we're working with? And how do we take a systems approach to all of the work that we're doing? So I'd love to talk more about Compassionate Systems in and of itself, but just wanted to get in that brief commercial, and then I'll be quiet.
Maybe we'll pop off and just because we're at time, I'm just I think Erica was going to talk about next steps for Seed.
Yeah, and so I know we're at time. I'm just going to pull up one quick slide about how to keep in contact and get involved. Really, we know it's been a lot of information, and so we're definitely going to be taking Kate and Joanne up on their offer to come back in the fall and have a follow-up conversation. Really focus on digging into that data and how do we use it at the local and regional level, and how do we amplify our voice? I think that's something that, there are opportunities to, get this on the attention of the right people within the region, within the school districts, health authorities, to really move this work forward. And so if you're interested in being a part of that conversation, we're going to send that out to everyone who's registered today. We'll send the recording and the additional resources and some follow-up information, but also just encourage you to check out the website because that's where we'll post all the information. And if you have any questions, you can contact us at our Seed email address. And then just put in a last plug for our regional table. So the regional table is open to everyone. It's a small group that has been growing and really, as Joanne and Kate and Caroline have highlighted, the intent is for it to be a collaborative forum across sectors to come together and discuss these questions and celebrate the successes that we have had in the region, and really open to anyone who wants to participate in that work. To exchange information and ideas and identify how we can continue to move this work forward within our region, and in supporting the local communities all across the North as well. So I think that's our quick wrap up, but we're happy to have you reach out to us and have a conversation or answer any questions by email as well. And just really want to thank you all for taking the time this morning and early afternoon to come together, and really appreciate Kate and Joanne, your willingness to share a region specific look at the HELP data for us in the North.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And we'll share our slides. There were, of course, many others that we didn't get to pop to, but you can take a look at what we've pulled out for you in the slide deck. And please reach out to us too if you have any questions. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks everybody. So nice to spend time with you. Hope you enjoy the sunny weekend.